Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
AI, the singularity, reality is but a dream? What next? It's hard to tell where we're going, but one thing for sure, radical change is on its way, and we're headed there fast. Are we looking at the eve of destruction or a new renaissance? Mission Evolution Radio TV show is coming to you around the world on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, xzbn.net. With us this hour to explore where radical changes are taking us is Douglas Grunther. Douglas graduated from Columbia University, where he was a Rhodes Scholarship finalist. He's been the featured speaker in front of national audiences and is a dreamwork facilitator certified by Dr. Jeremy Taylor, co-founder of the International Association for the Study of Dreams. His website, douglasgrunther.com. Douglas, thank you so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, it's this is really a topic that's kind of a hot topic right now. Is there's so much going on, and we don't know where it's taking us. And your background is in philosophy, depth, psychology, and media. How did you get interested in quantum theory and dreams?
Yeah, it kind of happened together because there was a book published in 1975 that I didn't get to until the mid-'80s called The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra. It was a controversial book that sold a lot of copies because here was a scientist, a PhD in physics, talking about the relationship between science and spirituality. And he wasn't just theorizing. He was pointing out that four of the major developers of quantum theory, the most successful science ever invented, and the reason you and I can talk like we are over the World Wide Web, the four major founders all had a serious lifelong interest in ancient Asian spiritual wisdom. Was that a coincidence, or is there an affinity between the quantum level of existence and the unconscious mind, the creative and spiritual element of our psyches? And that book was just a real game changer for me. Around the same time, I was experiencing some kind of weird medical symptoms. My blood work came out perfect. A friend of mine was a world-renowned allergist, and the test he gave me said I'm allergic to everything, which we both knew wasn't true. And long story short, kind of saying, what am I going to do? I went to a bookstore and said, let a book find me. And the book that found me was a book by Dr. Jeremy Taylor called Dreamwork. And after reading the book and practicing some of the methods of remembering more dreams and learning to work and play with my dreams, my symptoms went away. So it kind of was a synchronicity that at the same time, I'm not a scientist. I was not good at math in school, but the psychological and spiritual implications of quantum theory, as thought about by some of these major scientists, shows us that the gap between science and the spiritual aspect of our lives is not such a strong barrier. And that got me thinking about the relationship between our dreams and the world outside of us.
Well, it seems like that, I've always said that science and spirituality is on a head-on collision, that we simply don't have refined enough scientific measurements to pick up and read at the quantum level at this point. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, it gets interesting. I mean, Richard Feynman was a Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist, a brilliant man. And he famously said, anyone who says they understand quantum physics doesn't. So when you start hearing world-class scientists sounding like Zen masters, right, you know something's up. Now, to be honest, Gwilda, the vast majority of scientists, philosophers, and psychologists today are still what we call left hemisphere oriented rationalists. They buy into the materialist paradigm, which states that the world consists of objects and they're governed by causal laws. Well, that's true. But what started in 1900 and was stimulated by Einstein and the quantum revolution is that that's a limited view of all that's working, and that while Newtonian physics works at a certain level, there's much more going on deeper that's less rational and less predictable. And that's where quantum theory and what we call the right hemisphere of the brain, or dreamwork, intuition, imagination, start to come into play.
So is the thought that the right hemisphere of the brain is in touch with the quantum level?
We're on a tricky subject here. I would say yes. So perhaps we should start with what is the first section of what I wrote about, which is the difference between the left and the right hemisphere of the brains. And for this, I relied heavily on a real visionary thinker who's a contemporary thinker, Ian McGilchrist. And I'm heartened by the fact, Wilda, that his two books, which are complex, Ian is both a psychiatrist, a neurologist, and a philosopher. They've sold very well. He's become quite popular, and he's my go to guy on left and right hemisphere because he's done the most intense research, and his book has over 1,700 footnotes. Okay, so he's a spiritual person, but he's coming with a lot of empirical evidence. And what he points out is that what we normally assume is the difference between the left and the right hemisphere is wrong. Namely, that left hemisphere is logical, right hemisphere is imaginative. No, both hemispheres of our brains can be logical and imaginative. The biggest difference is in the way each of our hemispheres view the world. And normally we're unconscious of this, but it has a huge effect on how we think, on how we act, and what we believe. So, to cut it down to kind of basics, the left hemisphere operates by focusing in on small details, seeing the world as objects that need to be broken down into smaller parts and put together like a watch. Okay. The mechanical essence, which is what Newtonian physics is all about. But the left hemisphere's limitation is, and it's actually physically smaller and less intricately wired than our right hemisphere. We know that from neurology. The left hemisphere does not like to share, and it cannot deal with anything it considers ambiguous or uncertain. It requires certainty. Okay. So the right hemisphere of our brain, which is larger and more intricately wired, is given to us to take things in holistically as a whole. The right hemisphere doesn't understand something, breaking it down into parts. It takes it all in on an intuitive level and gets a deep feeling for it. The right hemisphere of our brain is where we show empathy. The right hemisphere is happy to share. It likes big picture thinking, and it likes to explore new areas, even if they're ambiguous and uncertain. So the
So
question comes, why did, yeah,
where did this information come from, and what studies back it up?
okay. It started in the 1960s with a surgery that was discovered that could help people with extreme epilepsy. And it was the only thing that could stop the violent. And they did it by cutting the corpus callosum, which is the fibers, the nerve fibers that create a barrier between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. And the doctor started realizing that patients started understanding reality in very different ways. And that's when they started to realize and take note of how the left hemisphere views the world and how the right hemisphere views the world. And we have hundreds of laboratory experiments and medical notations. And again, I point to Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which has over 1,700 footnotes, which can direct people to a lot of the laboratory studies that have been done.
I understand that, in fact, I've interviewed some people on the show, a medical doctor, actually a neurologist, that had a stroke and it affected one side of the brain rather than the other. And
Mhm.
she describes what it was like when it would go on and off and on and off. How when she would be in one side of the brain, it would be, oh, everything's fine. The other one's Mayday, Mayday. Okay, it was a beautiful lecture. But there's another example of how we're starting to see how they differ, the left from the right. Um, What was the conclusion that he came up with, the gentleman you're talking about?
Right. Well, the conclusion, which is very similar to where I would be, and a growing minority of philosophers and scientists and psychologists are coming to, is that we really need individually and culturally to regain a balance between the left and right hemispheres. We've been very overbalanced as Western culture and now as a planetary culture in the left hemisphere. And what are the ramifications of that? The left hemisphere is very good at creating technology, at putting parts together and coming up with new technologies. And we've all benefited from that. I mean, the invention of antibiotics 100 years ago has practically doubled the lifespan of human beings. So we're all very grateful for the new technology. But by focusing so much on how do we get more and more out of our technology, we were blind to the fact that our technology, primarily generated by fossil fuels, was literally disintegrating the very environment we need to exist here on the planet. And that's because the left hemisphere is tightly focused. It doesn't see the big picture. Evolution, which I call nature's intelligence, gave us the right hemisphere to get a bigger picture. And here's an example that Dr. McGilchrist gives, which I think really kind of gives a really good indication. So it turns out that all living creatures have a divided brain, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Why did evolution do this? Because we know, Gwilda, that evolution doesn't keep things around if they're not working.
Well,
And
Douglas, we're going to have to pick up on the other side of a station break with this leave kind of a cliffhanger, if you will.
okay.
Douglas and I will return shortly, so don't you go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. What is happening in your brain? With us this hour discussing the rapid shifts we're experiencing is Douglas Grunther. Douglas is the author of The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. Douglas, we were talking about what's happening in our brains. And so would you continue from where you were?
Sure. A good practical example of why we need a balance between the left and right hemispheres of our brain. The left hemisphere, very tightly focused, good at finding details. The right hemisphere is wired to take in the bigger picture. So here's an example Dr. McGilchrist gives. Say a thought experiment. Say we're a robin, right? A small bird. In order to survive, the robin has to find seeds in the ground, microscopic seeds. So it uses the left hemisphere of its brain to focus in and really find those microscopic seeds. Without that ability, it couldn't survive. But if it's too focused on the left hemisphere and not focused on the right hemisphere sees the bigger picture. While it will zero in on microscopic seeds, it won't see the shadow of a hawk, which is coming to make it lunch, right? So if we're not balanced, the robin will look for lunch and end up being lunch. How does that translate to our situation as humans? As I said before, we've produced this amazing technology that we all benefit from. But by not seeing the bigger picture, namely what the fossil fuel generated technologies were doing to the environment, we're now in a dramatic situation where climate change and global warming is already wreaking havoc on the world, and it's only going to escalate. And anyone who says, well, it's not as bad as the scientists say it's going to be, tell that to the millions of people who just got hammered by a hurricane in southeastern United States, which was supposed to be a force 1 hurricane. And then suddenly it's a force 4. That's the kind of escalation we're seeing because of global warming. And we're only now seeing the bigger picture. So in order to move forward and thrive and get us to a new renaissance, which I'm proposing we have a good chance of getting to, we're going to have to shift from the tightly focused left hemisphere, which is how do I get more stuff? How do I get more material stuff? How do I protect myself and my family? All of which are important. But if we don't see the bigger picture and understand how we connect to nature and what our activities are doing, we're not going to be in very good shape going forward. And so we need a shift from a very overly focused left hemisphere to the right hemisphere of our brain, which gets to a lot of the playful and really fun stuff that make life really worthwhile, which we can talk about. So it's about survival, but it's also about enjoying the incredible world we live in.
So, I know you're not a doctor and you're not a scientist, but from what you've been studying, has there been a deterioration in one side of the brain for not being used? And I know with epigenetics and everything else that can be changed.
It's I again, I don't, I'm not aware that there's any physiological damage to the brain for this. The damage is culturally and on a planetary level. It's the reason we're suffering from global warming and climate change, and it's the reason anxiety levels are being ramped up by the fact that AI, computer intelligence, is advancing at such speeds. The big game changer now, Gwilda, is um, we are experiencing as humans change at a rate faster than ever before in evolution. This change can be a huge advantage, but it can also be debilitating. And if we stick too much to the left hemisphere of the brain, which is focused on the small details, we're going to get caught up in all the anxiety of the World Wide Web and all the anxiety of climate change and economic dislocation and all that. We were given this beautiful right hemisphere, which is capable of integrating not only a bigger picture of what's happening now, but it's the right hemisphere of our brain, which is, we know this from neurology, where our dreams first come into our consciousness, where intuitive vision first comes into our consciousness, where any psychic ability might be, where people like Albert Einstein lived their lives. Albert Einstein, who Time magazine called the person of the century, and I think most of us would agree the greatest scientist of the 20th century, maybe of all time. He famously said, imagination is more important than knowledge. He also said, this is lesser known, it's been authenticated. He said, my entire career has been based on a dream I had when I was 11 years old. Now, why isn't that promoted more? Um, he was not the best at math. He was not the best at science. But his laboratory was not the physical laboratory of test tubes and Bunsen burners and chemicals. His laboratory was the imaginative part, the right hemisphere of his brain. And that's what he gave credit to discovering relativity.
So, if we back up quite a ways, you mentioned that synchronicity was what set you on this path. Where does synchronicity play in with all of this?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. We've all experienced synchronicity. It's a term coined by the great psychologist Carl Jung. And Carl Jung developed this because of an experience he had as he was becoming the most prominent uh, psychologist, psychoanalyst in Europe. Can I tell you that story? Because it's a real it's a beauty. And he
Sure.
cites this in his autobiography. So Carl Jung started by working with Freud, and Freud was a genius, but Freud was very autocratic and had kind of a limited view of the unconscious. And Jung was working with Freud, but noticed that with his patients and with his own dreams, he felt that Freud's vision of the unconscious was too limited. And so he was. They ended up splitting, and Jung started becoming really prominent, and he had a thriving psychology practice. But there was a woman client he had, an aristocratic woman, who, no matter all of his talents, she was resisting the therapy. She couldn't get around it, and they were not having success. And it was really frustrating Jung. And he finally decided that, in fairness, when she came in for her next appointment, he would say, look, we tried hard. It's not working. So there's no reason for us to continue. So she comes in for what was supposed to be her last session. And she's relating a dream she had where she's in ancient Egypt. And somebody presents her with this beautiful jeweled ring in the shape of a beetle, a scarab beetle. And the scarab beetle was a very powerful spiritual image in ancient Egypt. As she's relating this dream to Jung, Jung hears a tapping sound on his window of his office. And he walks over, and there's an insect banging against the window. So he opens the window, he's able to grab hold of the insect, and it's a beetle that looks more like a scarab beetle than any beetle in Europe. He can't believe it. He walks over to his client and says, Madam, here is your scarab beetle, and opens his hand. It so freaked her out that her resistance softened, and they ended up having very successful therapy after that. So Jung coined the term synchronicity to refer to two or more events which clearly weren't causally connected, but are too meaningfully connected to be just a coincidence. So how do you deal with that? If it's not Newtonian physics that created or caused that insect all of a sudden to tap against his window, and if it wasn't just a coincidence, what was it? And Jung came up with this term synchronicity. And he spent the rest of his career, including 20 years, in continuous conversation and meetings with Wolfgang Pauli. Talk about an interesting character. Wolfgang Pauli was a Nobel Prize winning quantum physicist who was fascinated with his dreams and confused by his dreams and sought out Carl Jung as a psychologist. So over 20 years, they developed a relationship where Pauli would give his dreams to Jung. Jung would give him insights into his dreams, and Jung would pick Pauli's brain about quantum theory, which Jung thought was connected to the theory of the collective unconscious. And together they were convinced, they couldn't prove it, but they were convinced, the most notable psychologists of the 20th century and one of the brightest quantum theorists on the planet were convinced that there was a direct line or direct link or gateway between the creative depth of the unconscious mind and the creative depths of the quantum realm.
Pretty
And
fascinating. So,
fascinating.
as you're speaking, what's coming to me is all of the indigenous peoples, from a lot of different places on the planet, would use synchronicity as omens. They've done that for years, you know. Does this relate?
You know, the older I get, Gwilda, the less nostalgic I become. I'm just so fascinated by where we are and where we might be headed. Okay. And that's why I'm interested in philosophy and depth psychology is the study of the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious mind. Okay. And um, and that's really what fascinates me and where I think is driving the future. Could you repeat the question again?
The question was the indigenous people all over the
Hmm.
planet use what you've just described as synchronicity as omenology. They've done that forever, putting things together.
Yeah.
You see a hawk in the west, it means this. And it seems to work for them. So, is this a
Right.
similar thing you're talking about?
Thanks. So when I think back on my life, I can come up with 16 synchronicities that best define where I've been, where I am, and where I might be going. And those synchronicities, we've all experienced synchronicities. Some of them I would call small synchronicities. An example, Gwilda, would be we're thinking about somebody we haven't talked to in a long time, and the next day they call us.
Right.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, did my thinking about them cause them to call me? I don't think so. Was it just a coincidence? Well, it doesn't feel like it was. But I can point to synchronicities that are the reason I'm talking to you right now. I'll just give you one example. It still
Well,
kind
we're
of flips me. Yeah.
we're gonna have to wait on that example because
Okay.
it's time to take another station break. Um, we will be back to continue our discussion. So you guys stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing evolution and the impact of AI is Douglas Grunther. His website, douglasgrunther.com. Douglas, let's change gears just a little bit. And you have some thoughts about AI and where we're going with it. Would you
Yeah.
express on that for me, please?
It connects with what we're talking about in terms of psychology. There's a process called projection, which is what we humans do. This was taught to me by my two dream teachers. In other words, we think we see the world for what it is. We see the world as it's projected through our own memory banks and our emotional experiences, etc. Okay, and we need to work hard to try to get a little closer to reality rather than just what we project onto the world. And what
But
we
wait a
yeah,
minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. If our reality is what we project on the world, how can we tell what reality is, and how can we get closer to it?
right. So yeah, by tapping into the right hemisphere of the brain and relying on our intuition, okay, and not just our rational ability to analyze things. All right, it has to come from a more intuitive place. So we tap more into our creative unconscious, which
Okay,
is
so if
connected
we're if
directly.
we're If we're tapping more into our creative unconscious, as I mentioned before, indigenous people have used, synchronicity and the creative unconscious um, to guide their lives with for millennium. However, there's a power curve there. There's a learning curve. There's techniques. What are you suggesting that we do in order to not only engage it but make sense of what it's saying?
Right. So there are many ways into that. There is tapping into your dreams, writing them down, playing them back like a movie and see how you react to it and playing with them and working with them. There's practicing intuition, going to a bookstore and see what book kind of is kind of jumping out at you. Some people use self-hypnosis, some people use meditation, some people use deep contemplation. Anytime we can quiet down our mind and slow down the brain waves, we now know from neurology that our everyday brainwave state is called beta. It's a fast speed, and it's where we're very anxious and on guard all the time. And advertisers and politicians love to get us there because then we're more vulnerable to buy stuff and vote for stuff that may not be in our best interest.
What
When we
makes us
slow down,
by being in beta, what makes us more vulnerable?
it's just the amygdala, which is part of our brain, gets on high alert. And if we think about it, our prehistoric ancestors had to be on high alert almost all the time. Why? When they left the cave, their their weapons were sticks and stones. Animals, predators out there were bigger and stronger. They didn't have agriculture. They didn't have gardening. They had to hunt for seeds and fruits. So they had to be on guard and kind of be telescopic most of the time. Nowadays, we need to shift that. Uh, Instead of hunter gatherers, we go to the supermarket and the food's there. We need to focus on the right hemisphere of our brain, which was wired to take in a slower brainwave, slow down our brain waves, and tune more directly into what we call reality, and we can get closer to it. But when we're
I've,
in a state
I've
of anxiety, we can't see it.
You mentioned in the beginning that to exist in like the caveman days, you didn't say about the caveman days. We were talking about the robin at the time, but they need both. They need to be able to, be hyper focused, to get their needs met. But they also need the bigger picture to not get eaten. So how does that relate?
Correct. So the balance is that we need a balance between the left and the right, and we're way over balanced to the left in our culture. It's obvious when you look at it. We're much more interested in analyzing things and trying to come up with certain answers than be willing to let our intuition play in the right hemisphere, which I call the ultimate playground of new ideas and new visions. I think we'd agree we need new visions. We need new ideas about how we connect to nature, how we connect to the world. AI, to get back to your question, can be a huge collaborator in this. Through AI, you and I are talking over the digital screen. Over 5.5 billion of our brains around the world are connected. Through keystrokes, we are connected to humanity's greatest knowledge and wisdom. But to get to it, this gets right to your question. In order to get to humanity's wisdom and knowledge, which are literally keystrokes away on the World Wide Web, we need to get through all the noise, all the chaos, all the advertisers trying to get us to buy stuff, all the bad actors who are trying to steal our identities. All the human brain has great capacity for wisdom, but also great capacity for addiction. So we have to watch out for kids getting addicted to social media. This has always been an issue. The brain can be very chaotic and noisy. Anyone who has practiced contemplation, meditation, self hypnosis, dream work knows that the first thing you do when you sit down to do this work is you have to deal with what? The chattering mind, right? The chaos, the loudness of our minds. It's the same with the World Wide Web, that AI now gives us the chance to collaborate on levels we've never had that before. Um, Yuval Noah Harari is the most famous historian on the planet, the author of *Sapiens*. The main theme of his book is the reason we are the most intelligent and powerful species on the planet, Gwilda, is because of our capacity to collaborate. So the World Wide Web, AI driven, is the most collaborative medium by far that we've ever had. But we have to be willing to get through the noise of the web Hey, you've got 5.5 million brains and nervous systems connected. Of course, it's going to be noisy and chaotic. Why would we expect any different? It's noisy enough when we get into a problem with our family or our friends. But we think we're going to get on a world wide web with 5.5 billion brains, and people emailing and podcasting. But there's amazing visionaries exchanging information on the world wide web. Scientists are advancing at rates never before thought. Medicine is advancing. So we have to take advantage of the collaborative nature of our brain and deal with the noisy, competing anxiety level.
So the when you're talking about the AI and everything moving really, really quickly, and we have that puts us in one side of our brain, which is not the one that connects with higher level information, if you will. Are you telling me that the key here is being able to switch from one brainwave frequency to the other rather than being stuck in beta?
Boy, you've really hit you've hit it right on the mark. Um, one of the most fascinating research I was able to do. I found two really good visionary thinkers about this, and they both advocate the same thing, which is it's kind of an ironic paradox, um, which is in the 21st century, we both have to speed up our brains when we're on the digital screen because the pixels that are vibrating on the screen, and the computer energy, that the AI that's behind the digital screen, is forcing our brains to work at a faster rate than we're normal. Okay. If you know, young kids don't have as much problem with this because their brains have been already rewired, just as my generation's brains were rewired for television, which my parents weren't. This is can be traced right through all of media history. So on the one level, we have to speed our brains up, but then we have to get off the screen and slow down the brain waves to where we can contemplate, meditate, focus on the bigger picture, and tap more into things like our dreams, our intuitions, the inner lab, what Einstein would refer to as the inner laboratory of our imagination.
So
So it's interesting.
what would you see happening if indeed more people were suddenly seeking this balance? What would be the benefit as far as taking in all this information at beta and then having that information available when you go into alpha or theta?
A renaissance literally means a rebirth. And what people forget, because when we were taught about the Renaissance, Gwilda, is, oh, I remember that was like 500 years ago, 600 years ago in Italy, and all this great art happened. We had the Sistine Chapel and the Statue of Day, all of which were magnificent. But it was much more complex than that. The Renaissance, if we're going to get to the next Renaissance, we have to understand how Renaissances have happened in the past, right? We have some guidelines. So during the Italian Renaissance, we had a flourishing of art. We also had the creation of science when Galileo peered through his telescope and saw that the Earth is not the center of the universe. How's that for a game changer? And literally created what we now call science, where you get to observe through advanced technology, microscopes, telescopes, and get a better understanding of how the universe works on a mechanical level. But also, the Italian Renaissance brought in a new philosophy called humanism, which was a celebration of the individual human mind. Now, we tend to take that for granted, but during the Middle Ages, you weren't allowed to have an individual mind unless you were a royal member of the royal family or a high level church officer. Because if you started giving opinions, you were either excommunicated or executed. But the Italian Renaissance comes in, and all of a sudden people say, wait a minute, there's so much about the individual mind that is worthwhile. Now, here we are in the 21st century. We have advanced science. Um, we celebrate the individual human mind, and nowhere is that more celebrated than on the World Wide Web. For all the complaints about the web, Gwilda, in the 60s, up in, it was a fabulous time, but guess what? There were three major TV networks, some local radio stations. There was no satellite media. And basically, the information came from a small handful of sources. And how could you talk back? Write a letter to the editor? Maybe. Here
Yeah.
we are in the 21st century, and you've got people in their living rooms with 100,000 followers. We can
Well,
talk
we're
back
we're
now.
we're going to have to talk back on the other side of a station break. Please stay with us as Douglas and I continue to explore our rapidly changing reality. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Are we undergoing another renaissance? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Douglas Grunther. His website, douglasgrunther.com. Douglas, do you believe that we're actually undergoing another renaissance or have the opportunity to initiate another renaissance?
I think we're being pointed towards one. Um, and But what we have to understand is because people say, well, how can we be pointing towards a renaissance when there's all this chaos in the world? Let's go back to the Italian Renaissance. The main stimulant that encouraged the Italian Renaissance was the existence of the Black Plague, which was on its way to killing a third of Europe, rich and poor alike, and they didn't even know the cause. And the small percentage of people who were even literate back in the 14th century got together, and they were in Italy. They were living in cities. They had walled cities, so those walls helped protect them from the rats that were actually the cause of the Black Plague. And they realized, humanity could be coming to an end. There's this plague, and we don't even know what's causing it. It's killing every people we know. And they said, the very least we need to do as humans is try to gather as much wisdom as we can and leave it in case we survive this. So we just went through COVID, which was a terrible, terrible virus. It killed 7 million people worldwide, a real tragedy. But that's very small compared to what could be happening with global warming and climate change. And we have to understand that rebirth, renaissances are usually stimulated by a lot of chaos. So the trick is, how do you get through the chaos to the light within? And I want to point to something because, in a way, the wonderful phrase that I see you use during your breaks, which is I wrote it down: open your mind, question everything. Right? That's the secret. That's a right hemisphere statement. Okay, the left hemisphere of our brain is not willing to open up and question everything. It's too ambiguous. It's too uncertain. It's too mysterious. The right hemisphere of our brain was wired to not only open our minds and question everything, but play with it, explore it, get excited by that. So that's really, I think, what we're being called upon. And that's not easy to do when we see all the anxiety around us. But that's why it's even more important than ever to open our minds. And we know so much more about the human mind now, and question everything. So I believe we're being pointed to a new renaissance because the reason we're here to begin with and haven't disappeared is because through nature's intelligence, well before we ever showed up on the planet, uh, microscopic entities, viruses and bacteria, that then became insects, and then plants and insects, and eventually mammals and us. We now know through brilliant scientists like Lynn Margulis, when I discovered her, it really made my whole body vibrate, because she was able to show that at the very microscopic level, nature is always pulling towards more complex and new forms of collaboration. If we only look on the surface, what do we see? We see competition, predator prey, which is part of reality. We were taught that Darwin's famous phrase was survival of the fittest. That's not Darwin's phrase. That was a colleague of his. And when it became so popular, Darwin had to deal with it. He made it very clear that by fittest, he wasn't talking about the strongest and most powerful. He was talking about the most adaptable and resilient. So we now know from studying evolution that we are being called upon here, right, to access the part of our brain that can question everything and find new ways of seeing things, and deepen our connection to nature's beauty, and magnificence. At the same time, we have to get through the anxiety and open our minds. And evolution is calling for us to collaborate. And what do we have in front of us? The very medium you and I are talking on now, by far the most collaborative medium ever devised, the World Wide Web. And as I said before, if you can get underneath all of the noise and chaos, and even people doing well by, posting 100 photos of your grandchild and what they're eating for breakfast. If we get beneath all of that, there's a handful or more of brilliant visionary thinkers right now communicating with each other through the World Wide Web, exchanging ideas, testing out theories, and looking at and thinking of the larger context of the new things we're learning through science and the new things that people are learning through ancient techniques you point, meditation, and the kinds of things that our ancient ancestors were tuned into. The
So,
more we open our mind, yeah,
Douglas, it's that time in the show when I get to ask you, what's your mission?
my mission is to get people excited about the part of our brain that is wired for imagination, intuitive leaps, new ways of looking at things. This is what makes life exciting to me is when I wake up every day, what am I going to experience that I couldn't predict? I will look forward to things I know what I'm going to cook for dinner, but if we're open to it, I believe synchronicities will increase. And I think that we'll tune into the fact that nature is calling on us. This is my fervent hope that we will hear nature's call, which is kicking and screaming, perhaps. We need to become more collaborative, more empathic, more open to the mysteriousness of life. And that's why I celebrate the unconscious, and and that's why I am hopeful that more and more people will do it. And to me, the reason to be optimistic, because there's plenty of reasons to be pessimistic, and I don't ignore those in my research. I count on the insight from the great anthropologist Margaret Mead, one of those brilliant people who walked this planet in the 20th century. And she said, never doubt that a small group of concerted, interested people can change the world, because that's the only thing that ever has.
Well, as you're speaking once again, and we put it into a nutshell, it sounds like you're saying it has to start with the individual, and the individual has to be able to change their brainwaves in order to do this. So, how do you recommend that each individual participate in time?
Okay. I'd start with your mantra that I saw on your screen. Open your mind and question everything. And I would what I specifically recommend is if you keep a notebook by the side of your bed and label it "My Dreams," and before you fall asleep every night, you say, um, if you bring me a dream, I'll remember it and write it down. Even if it wakes you up in the middle of the night and it's a big long dream, write down the basic elements and start to play with your dreams. You don't have to be a dream expert to take advantage of dreams. Elias Howe invented the first sewing machine because of a nightmare that he had. And the nightmare actually gave him the information on on why he and others were being unsuccessful. But it doesn't just have to be our dreams. Find a creative
So,
way to meditate.
quick question. You say play with your dreams. What do you
Hmm.
mean by that? How do we play with a dream?
Okay. Our dreams have a wonderful sense of humor. They love to play with us. They like to trick us. They're very much like a Zen master. Um, it's perfectly it's perfectly legitimate to analyze one's dream. That's left hemisphere. That works. Break it down. Okay, I dreamt about a river. What does water mean? Water usually means the emotions. But to really get to the heart of your dream or to your intuitive level of thinking, play with it. Have fun with it. Ask it questions. If you remember a dream, replay it in your mind and ask the people in your dream or the objects in the dream, what are you doing here in my unconscious? And the more you do that, the more you play with that, you might be surprised. You start getting some answers.
So, are you talking about shifting our dreams to being more lucid?
That is one possibility. Lucid dreams are pretty rare. The most powerful dream I ever had was a lucid dream, but I've only had a few of them. A lucid dream is a dream where you're literally aware that you're dreaming and you can actually shapeshift the dream as you're dreaming it, which is very shamanic and cool. Um, but but I've also had life-changing dreams um, that were not lucid, and some of them I sort of got that aha moment of the when you've reached when you get to a point where you got the meditation or you got the contemplation or you got the new idea or you understand your dream. It's an aha moment. You feel it physically. You don't have to guess. It's not intellectual, right? You feel it in
So,
your body.
so if we go into these aha moments, is that when it starts to filter over from the more creative part of our brain to the logical one?
Well, certainly the two are connected. And the more they can share information, the better. But the left hemisphere, and again, this comes from really good, hard neurological laboratory evidence. The left hemisphere of our brain, where our culture puts most of its emphasis, right, does not like to share. The right hemisphere does. It's our job as the director of our brain to make sure that the useful information that our left hemisphere picks up by analyzing things, that we, as the director of our brain, bring it back to the right hemisphere to play with it in a more creative, imaginative, big picture, and not be totally analytical, but be more
Well,
intuitive.
well, Douglas, unfortunately, we're totally out of time. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me on your show.
Our guest this hour has been Douglas Grunther, the author of The Quantum and the Dream, Visionary Consciousness, AI, and the New Renaissance. To find out more about Douglas, where you can find his book and all he has to offer, visit his website, douglasgrunther.com. This has been Mission Evolution with Gwilda Wiyaka. For more information or to enjoy past archived episodes, visit missionevolution.org. And be sure to join us here next time. The mission will continue, bringing information, resources, and support to our evolving world.